Luffy has had so many fights in One Piece, but not all of his fights were up to a good standard, so I thought it would be fun to rank every Luffy fight in One Piece from the worst to the best. Now I have divided these fights in 5 different tiers: the D tier, the C tier, the B tier, A tier and S tier. And also I'm not going to include any fights from the Outback arc because that arc hasn't been fully animated yet, so I'm only going to start from the Robin's Dawn all the way to the Egghead arc. So let's see how I rank these fights. So with the D tier, this is the tier where I personally thought that the fights either were not good, disappointing, or were fights I just didn't really care much about. Whenever I go through the series again, these are the fights that I don't really look forward to. Starting at the bottom, I have Luffy vs Zoro at Whiskey Peak. I think this fight was pointless, and the whole premise behind the fight was pretty stupid in my opinion. I don't know why Luffy would trust random strangers over the words of the right-hand man of his crew. I feel that Luffy was acting a little bit out of character here, and I think even the writers realised how bad the fight is, because even the live action series didn't bother to adapt this fight, but they had no problem adapting the other fights. Then next, I have Luffy, Sanji and Usopp vs Satori from Skypiea. I thought this fight was boring and uninteresting. Whenever I re-watch Skypiea, this is the fight I don't look forward to. Then after that, I have fights that were either cut way too short or were just forgettable. These are all interchangeable, but Luffy vs Kobe, Luffy vs the Mink Warriors, Dory, Mr. Free, Gecko Moria, Viper, Fujitora, the Beast Pirates from Udon Prison, Sphinx from Impel Down, Hannibal, Frankie, Smoker during Marineford, Buggy and Alvida from Locktown, and Luffy vs the Dressrosa combatants, except on Chinchou because I have that fight ranked higher. Most of these fights were either just too forgettable for me or were just plain boring to watch. Now let's move on to the C tier. With the C tier, these are fights that I find to be just fine. Not great, not bad, just okay. First I have Luffy vs Alvida. This is Luffy's first fight against a pirate in the series, so it is a very memorable fight since that is the beginning of what's to come for Luffy as a pirate. Next I have Luffy vs Ulti. This fight could have been much better, but I do like the headbutt clash that happened between the two of them. Next I have Luffy vs Caesar the first time. I do like how they showcase how deadly Caesar's powers were with his ability to remove oxygen from his opponent, but I wish this fight was longer. Next is Luffy vs Jinbei. This is another fight I feel could have been better, but it was still entertaining nonetheless, since those two were allies during the Summit War saga. Next is Luffy vs Mihawk. This is another short skirmish, but I think the scene of Mihawk cutting the iceberg is always great to see. Next is Luffy and Zoro vs Morgan and his marines. This was only a chapter long, but it is where we see Zoro join the Straw Hats, and the first time that we see the two of them working together. Also, Luffy punching Helmeppo was satisfying to see. Next is Luffy vs Moji. Seeing Luffy punch Moji was very satisfying after seeing him burn down the pet food store, but that's as high as I can rank this fight, since not that much really happens in the fight. Next is Luffy vs the Boa Sisters. I do find the double food powers quite interesting, and seeing Luffy using Conqueror's Haki was cool to see. Next I have Luffy and Mr. Free vs Magellan. I liked how they both worked together in bypassing Magellan's poison, with Luffy using wax as an armor, but it was cut too short for me to put it much higher. Next is Luffy vs Garp. This was a very emotional moment in the Marineford arc. Even though Garp doesn't really fight him, he just takes the punch, but this whole confrontation was still very good despite that. Then I have Luffy vs Wapol. Wapol's abilities were very wacky and funny, but that is part of the charm about One Piece, and Luffy making sure that the flag doesn't get shot down is one of Luffy's best moments in the entire series in my opinion. Next I have Luffy vs Foxy. It was a bit of a goofy fight, but I did like the small strategies used by Luffy, like him using the mirror to deflect the slow beam. Now next I have two fights, and they are Luffy vs Big Mom in Whole Cake Island and Wano. I think both fights could have been much better, but they were cut way too short. I might give the Whole Cake Island fight the slight edge, because Luffy clashing with Big Mom in his Gear 4 state was really cool. Next I have Luffy vs Bellamy in Dressrosa. Not quite as good as their first fight, but it was still fairly entertaining. And you start to feel bad for Bellamy because of how bad Doflamingo treated him even though he looked up to him. Next is Luffy vs Smoker in their first fight at Locktown. This was our first time seeing a low-gear double fruit user in action, and Smoker looked impossible to defeat, especially since Haki wasn't introduced as a power system at this point in the story. This was also one of the few moments where Smoker actually looked threatening, and then the fight ends with Dragon making his debut into the story. Next I have Luffy vs Captain Kuro. This fight was pretty enjoyable. Captain Kuro had an interesting fighting style, the fight had solid choreography, and Kuro as a villain was threatening enough to make you want to see Luffy take him down for good, especially seeing how badly he treated his crewmates. And for the last fight in the C tier, I have Luffy vs Kizaru and Saturn at Egghead Island. This fight was just funny and comical, which is what you would expect from Luffy in Gear 5, where he pretty much has the powers of Toon Force. Also, seeing him stand up against one of the Admirals and one of the 5 Elders on a 2v1 just makes Luffy that much cooler. With this B tier, these are fights I consider to be good and slightly above average. I think all of these fights each have great moments in them, and I feel that all of them are pretty memorable when you watch or read One Piece. So first I have Luffy vs the Sea Monster. This was from the first chapter and Luffy's first time in combat as a pirate. It was a nice and quick fight and prepares you for what's to come in the story. Then next I have Luffy vs Buggy. This fight was entertaining from start to finish. I love Buggy's level-through powers and the small flashback between him and Shanks. And this was back when Buggy was actually a threat to Luffy, which I do appreciate. Next I have Luffy vs Hody. This fight was very high stakes because Zenoa was literally on its way to destroying Fishman Island, so Luffy had to take him down before then. And seeing Luffy use Gum Gum Red Hawk as a homage to his late brother Ace was well executed, and this was also Luffy's first major fight after the 2-year time skip. I just wish this fight had more action since Luffy only landed a few hits and Hody was already knocked out. Next I have Luffy vs Big Mom's army at Whole Cake. This fight showed Luffy's incredible determination in waiting for Sanji to come back to him, and he was willing to face off one of the Yonko's crews by himself in order to see Sanji again. And the fact that he lost because he was pretty much starving the entire time was an interesting way to end the fight, since it only raised the stakes even higher. Next, I have Luffy's rematch against Caesar. This is another fight with very high stakes, with the Shino Kunigas quickly approaching everyone, and Caesar was standing in Luffy's way. It was really satisfying seeing Luffy beat up Caesar after all that he has done to the children and Brownbeard's crew as test subjects, even though they all looked up to him as a saviour. And Luffy running to use the Grizzly Magnum to finish off Caesar was one of the better moments from Punk Hazard. Next I have Luffy vs Vivi. I think this was one of the best moments from Alabasta. What made that fight so good was the character writing from both characters and their opposing views on the outcome of their civil war. Luffy brings a harsh truth about people dying in a civil war, and that Vivi should instead rely on her friends for help instead of trying to do everything herself and risking her own life in the process. This moment is what makes Luffy such a great character. Next is Luffy vs Blackbeard. Although the fight was really short, it was still great seeing the two of them face to face, because the story is doing a very good job at building up these two characters to being rivals and becoming the next Pirate King. This fight was only a small teaser to the eventual fight at the end of the series, because I believe that Blackbeard is the true final villain of the series. Next is Luffy vs Bellamy and Jaya. I think most people would agree that this was one of the most satisfying moments in all of One Piece. Seeing Bellamy just insult Luffy and attacking him without fighting back just makes you dislike Bellamy as a character, and Oda did a great job in portraying that. And then to see Luffy end him with just one punch and seeing everyone's reaction to Luffy having a higher bounty than Bellamy is one of the most memorable moments in the Jaya arc. Next is Luffy vs Aokiji. This was Luffy's first fight against a Navy Admiral, and this was a great way in showing the massive gap in power between Rocky Pirate and one of the 3 admirals of the world government. There was no Haki at the time, so there was literally nothing Luffy could do to even land a hit on Aokiji. Next I have Luffy and Ace versus the Marines. This was the last time that we see Luffy and Ace fight together, and just seeing them work well together in synergy against the Marines after Luffy finally freeing Ace was amazing to see. Next is Luffy vs Don Krieg. I think this fight is pretty underrated and is definitely one of the best fights in East Blue Saga. The manga version I think is a lot better because of how well the panels flow together, and just seeing Luffy using his grit to defeat Don Krieg was great visually and narratively. Next I have Luffy's second fight against Kaido on the rooftop. Although the fight was short, it was amazing seeing Luffy learn to advance his Kage's Haki to where he could deal damage to Kaido, since that was the technique he was training for in Act 2. And seeing him lose to Kaido again just raised the stakes even higher during the raid on Onigashima. Next is Luffy and Bonnie versus the 5 Elders. Seeing Bonnie team up with Luffy, who has the powers of Son God Nika, who was an important figure in Bonnie and Koba's lives, was a great moment in the Egghead arc after seeing what those characters have been through. And it was also very satisfying to see Bonnie land a Nika punch on Saturn after all of the suffering he has put Kuma and Bonnie through. Next I have Luffy vs Lucci in Water 7. This was where we saw Lucci reveal his Devil Fruit, and the reveal that the Galileo workers were actually CP9 members in disguise. Seeing Lucci just job Luffy with ease was a great way to end the Water 7 arc, because Robin got taken away due to Luffy's loss. Next I have Luffy vs Cracker. I found Cracker's abilities to be creative and fits the whole theme about the Big Man Pirates being based on sweets and desserts. Tagline was also pretty cool too. Next I have Luffy, Law and Kid versus the Marines. It was great seeing the abilities of the other pirates from the West Generation, and this was a great way to build up the rivalry between the three of them. Next I have Luffy, Jinbei and Crocodile versus the Impel Down Guard. It was nice seeing Crocodile fight again, and him joining forces with Luffy was interesting. I also liked Jinbei's contributions to the prison break too. Next I have Luffy, Zoro, Chopper and Sanji versus the Frankie family. One of the more satisfying beatdowns in One Piece because of how badly Usopp was humiliated. Next I have Luffy versus Magellan. I think this fight is underrated, and this fight just raised even more stakes in the whole Summit War saga than there already was. Luffy's loss was a huge consequence, because he was losing hours of time trying to recover from the poison, and time was very crucial during this time. I liked Magellan's Devil Fruit powers and would like to see more from him in the future. And the final fight I have in the B tier is Luffy vs Crocodile 2. This was where Luffy figured out the weakness of Crocodile's Devil Fruit, and there was a layer of strategy with this fight. And that is something I really appreciated and will always enjoy every time I go through the Alabasta arc. Now moving on to the A tier, these are fights that I find amazing and will always love every time I rewatch them. Starting with Luffy vs Blueno. This fight gets better every time I watch it. This is where we get the first reveal of Luffy using his gears, and it was a very well paced fight with great action. Next I have Luffy vs Oars. I think this was the best fight in Thriller Bark. Nightmare Luffy is one of my favourite forms of Luffy, and it was great seeing him just beat down Oars. Next I have Luffy vs Pacifista PX5. Although the fight was extremely short, it was still amazing because you really see how far Luffy has come in the past 2 years, considering how badly the Straw has struggled facing one Pacifista the last time. Luffy dodging the light beams is one of his coolest moments, and it was a great way to get you excited for One Piece in the post-time skip. Next I have Luffy and the Giants versus the 5 Elders. Seeing all the 5 Elders appear on Egghead was hype, and Luffy being able to stand his own against them was pretty cool to see. Next is Luffy versus the Celestial Dragon. Now this might not be considered a fight to some of you, because the Celestial Dragon never fought back, but it still involved Luffy punching him in the face, so Luffy was ready to fight. This was easily the best punch in all of One Piece, and one of Luffy's most memorable moments. Nothing is more satisfying than seeing the Celestial Dragons get what they deserve. Next I have Luffy vs Lucci on Egghead. Although it was quite one-sided, it was still great seeing Lucci again after so long, and seeing that he awakened his Devil Fruit was very interesting. The anime version I think elevated this fight from the manga, and seeing Luffy use his comical abilities in Gear 5 to mess with Lucci was really entertaining. Next I have Luffy vs Sanji. I know Luffy never fought back in this fight, but it is still considered a fight. This is one of the more emotional fights in One Piece, just seeing Sanji take all of his anger out on Luffy and wanting to leave the crew even though Luffy can see through all of his lies. This was one of the highlights of Whole Cake Island, and it still hits hard every time I see it. Next I have the Straw Hats versus the Pacifista, Kizaru and Sentomaru. This fight had such high stakes because they were up against characters way out of their league, and to see Luffy actually admit that they are not strong enough and should instead run away goes to show the massive gap between them. And this fight led to the Straw Hats being separated for 2 years, leaving Luffy all by himself for the Summit War saga. This fight was a huge reason to why the Sabaody arc is one of my personal favourite arcs in One Piece. Next I have Luffy's first fight versus Crocodile. This fight is what made Crocodile so threatening and how menacing he was as a villain. The fight ended in Luffy losing, and whenever Luffy loses against a major villain, it really raises the stakes because he is the one who everyone bets on to win. Next is Luffy vs Usopp. Out of all the fights Luffy has had with his crewmate, this is by far the best one. To me, this was Luffy vs Sanji but done a little bit better, because Usopp was really serious about leaving the crew and disrespecting his captain, but we knew that Sanji deep down wanted to stay with his crew. There was a lot of emotion in this fight as well, and I liked all the tactics Usopp was using because he knows how Luffy fights. This was the top highlight of Water 7. Next I have Luffy's first fight against Kaido in Wano. This fight was like Luffy's first fight with Crocodile, but a little better, because of how much build up Kaido has been given, and to see him just one-shot Luffy in his Gear 4 state was jaw-dropping. Next I have Luffy vs Enel. I like the strategies used in this fight, and the fact that Enel's weakness was Luffy's rubber body just made this fight the perfect matchup. There was great build up throughout Sky Pier, with Enel being such an unbeatable force, and Luffy trying to ring the bell as he defeated Enel was the perfect way to wrap up all of the storylines in the Sky Pier saga. Next, I have Luffy versus the 3 Admirals in Marineford. Hands down one of the greatest moments in One Piece, seeing Luffy reach the plaza standing up to 3 Admirals who were all way stronger than him in order to save Ace. Anyone who has seen One Piece can never forget this moment because of how hype it is and the fact that Luffy is fighting in a war full of people out of his league makes this moment that much better. And finally, we have the S tier. All of these fights are top tier, with each of them being incredibly memorable and impactful to the entire series of One Piece. Every time I go through the series again, these are the fights I look forward to the most, and they never disappoint. So starting off in the S tier, I have Luffy vs Kizaru on Egghead. What made this fight so exciting is the fact that Luffy actually held his own against a Navy Admiral. Just seeing how far he has come since their last fight in Sabaody makes you appreciate Luffy's growth. And the anime version made this fight even better with how both fighters use their abilities with high quality animation. Next is Luffy vs Crocodile 3. This was their second rematch, and this was definitely the best out of the 3 fights that Luffy has had with Crocodile. Seeing Luffy using his own plot as an alternative method to damage Crocodile was creative and a very smart tactic that won Luffy the battle. And the impact of this fight was too high, because this was Luffy's first time beating a warlord of the sea, Alabasta was finally free, and Luffy became more infamous as a pirate because of this fight. This was a great climax to all that was being built up to this arc ever since they reached the Grand Line. Next I have Luffy vs Arlong. This was easily the best fight in the entire East Blue saga, because of the great action, Arlong being a brilliant antagonist for the early portion of One Piece, and Luffy finally saving Nami from her suffering. There is non-stop action, great choreography, and it does not drag on for too long. Arlong Pog is normally seen as the arc that will get people hooked onto One Piece, and this fight was a huge reason for that. Even the Straw Hats walk to Arlong Park in the anime was iconic and was a great way to build up to this fight. Next, I have the Worst Generation vs Kaido and Big Mom. This entire fight was just amazing from start to finish. Every fighter had great moments in this fight, and that scene of Luffy hitting Kaido with the Red Rock is truly unforgettable. Next, I have Gear 5 Luffy vs Kaido. This was in my opinion the best fight in Wano, and is definitely the most memorable part of the entire arc. We get Luffy turning into Gear 5 for the first time, making it one of the most iconic transformations in the last decade. And this final fight was a climax to a very long saga that started pretty much from Punk Hazard when Luffy and Law formed an alliance to beat Kaido. So both narratively and in terms of action, this fight was brilliant. Next I have Luffy vs Doflamingo. Another insane fight with some great choreography, and seeing how Doflamingo utilized his strengths in combat was very creative, and just him as a villain made this fight even more engaging. Especially seeing how Doflamingo was responsible for all of the darkness that Dressrosa has been covered in for many years. We also get the reveal of Luffy's Gear 4 for the first time, which is always going to be hype no matter how many times you've seen this fight. Next, I have Luffy vs Lucci at Enies Lobby. There are several reasons for why this fight is such a fan favourite. The action is top tier, Lucci was an amazing antagonist for Luffy, there was high emotional stakes with this, with the Straw Hats saving Robin, and Usopp literally telling Luffy to never give up even after they had a big argument in Water 7. And the Gum Gum Jet Gatling moment is one of Luffy's best moments when it comes to fight scenes. This fight is always a joy to watch no matter how many times you see it, and is one of the reasons for why the Enies Lobby arc is so beloved by fans. And finally, my number 1 Luffy fight in One Piece goes to Luffy vs Katakuri. I think most people will agree that Luffy vs Katakuri is either their favourite fights in One Piece or at least in the top 3. I think this fight has the best action, best choreography. I love that they fought in the mirror dimension, so the whole setting for the fight was top notch. You have Luffy being able to see the future, Snake Man Luffy was revealed here too. Katakuri as an antagonist was brilliant because his abilities were similar to Luffy's, making them such a great matchup. I don't think Luffy has showed more willpower in any other fight scene than this one. And the fact that this fight ends in Katakuri falling on his back for the first time in combat was the perfect way to end this fight. There was just so much to like in this fight, and I like him more every time I watch it. And that is my total ranking for every Luffy fight from the worst to the best. What are your favourite Luffy fights in One Piece? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please like. If you'd like to see more anime content, please subscribe for more. I'm trying to reach 1000 subscribers by the end of the year, so I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next video.